So, hello, everybody, and thank you for spending your Wednesday evening with us. We have about an hour for the workshop today, so I'm going to get right to some table setting and get our presentation started. My name is Tucker, and I'm the Water Access Steward for Advocates for Urban Agriculture. Advocates for Urban Agriculture. Excuse me. This evening, I'll be your host. A little bit about AUA. AUA transforms food access, local economies, community wellness, and climate resiliency in Chicagoland through policy, advocacy, education, and resources to safely grow medicine and food. We primarily serve working class residents and earth stewards on the south and west sides of the city. A land acknowledgement. As advocates for urban agriculture, we acknowledge that we all live and work on stolen land. Our region consists of settler colonial towns and cities, which many of us came to as uninvited guests. The Chicago region is the ancestral home of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Odawa, as well as the Miami, Peoria, Ho-Chunk, Kickapoo, Sac, Fox, and Sioux tribes. Despite past forced removal from these lands and ongoing colonialism, Chicago is home to the sixth largest urban indigenous population in the US, many of whom continue to practice their heritage and care for these lands and waterways that we call home. As agriculture practitioners and earth stewards, we honor their legacy in this place. A few words from Val, who could not be here today, but I promise she will be back for the next week's event. This is from Val. This webinar series started as an idea or seed in which Val wanted to highlight the work of people who have inspired her throughout her growing and conservation journey. She is super thankful for you, Daniel, our presenter, for being here and presenting on your work and research. A few quick observations from me on the series. Val conceived and did the legwork for this series entirely on her own. This is her brainchild. She is incredibly excited to host this series because it features some of her very good friends who are all doing amazing things. You'll find that this series is wide-ranging and cross-disciplinary. The through line for every event in the series is Indigenous-led stewardship of land and water. And we hope that you'll be back every Wednesday at 6 p.m. through November for these events. Quick reminder, this webinar is being recorded. For those in need of interpretation, if you go down to the bottom of your screen and go to the right and click interpretation next to the sphere, you can click the language that you would like to hear. Tonight we're offering Spanish. And you can also choose to mute the original audio. You can do so and you won't hear my voice, which might minimize crosstalk. That would be my voice and the interpreter's voice at the same time. If you haven't already, please drop your name in the chat and let us know where you're coming from and what you look forward to seeing in this presentation. For the bulk of our evening tonight, we're going to ask that you drop questions that you have about the presentation in the chat. And we have designated times where I'll be reading the questions to Daniel, and then Daniel will be answering. Again, these are during designated times. With that, thank you very much. And I'm going to let our producer or our presenter introduce themselves. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is Dr. Daniel Hayden. I am happy to be here tonight. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the at Loyola University here in Chicago. I'm just very new to Chicago. I moved here with my wife in April. I'm in the School of Environmental Sustainability, and my a lot of my research interest and background is indigenous farming, indigenous agriculture. And so I'll sort of give the whole spiel, the whole idea about this idea that I've been looking at for a long time. What is indigenous farming? When I bring up that idea. And I think it's kind of interesting that my presentation is first because I think it really lays a good groundwork for introducing other ideas of the presenters that you'll most likely hear later in the month. So sort of just bring some ideas to light, getting things sort of going. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Let me all right, so a little bit about myself. I am an enrolled citizen of the Comanche Nation of Oklahoma. I'm also Pawnee, Muskogee Creek. Both my parents are Native American. They both serve their tribal communities through their different occupations. My mom was a lawyer, my dad was a construction worker. So as a plant scientist, I really wanted to, serve my own tribal communities through my own interest in ways, which is why I'm doing a lot of work I'm doing now. I'm a plant pathologist by training, so I study plant diseases. That's why I did my PhD at University of Wisconsin-Madison for. I'd say I'm a plant doctor. That's technically kind of true in lots of ways, taking care of plants. And then this picture here is of me, my wife Amber, my occasional research assistant. She has guided me and, been very supportive of a lot of the work that I've been doing. I want to acknowledge her. And then also very recently, very, very recently, as of 2 weeks today, I'm a dad. So that's exciting, fun news. There's little Meadow with her head of hair right there. So yeah, so today I'll just talk about a lot about my work. I think I'm very open, lots of questions, lots of talk about, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat because it's something I do a lot and talk about a lot. So, you know, I'm open and I've been researching this idea a lot for a very long time too. So I'll present off with this picture right here. And this is of Carroll University, Carroll College back in the day, around 1910. It's a private university near Milwaukee. And you can see, this very old black and white picture, and from the Historical Society of Wisconsin. And you can sort of see these black mounds, these black ridges on the ground. And this is actually a cornfield that indigenous peoples were growing corn on for centuries. These are the mounds that people would grow corn on. And obviously, it looks very different from our image of what a cornfield looks like today. If you drive, an hour outside, say, Chicago or so, you'll see these rows, these monocultures, these vast, rows of corn, soybean. And it's just kind of interesting. We have this really interesting evidence right here of indigenous farming. How were things being done? And I think this whole point of this talk, I really want to emphasize is the more historical aspect of it, the really introduce, how that influences practices and ideas now, per se. So, Carroll College was, this picture was in 1910. The college was founded in 1830s. That was right after the Black Hawk War, when a lot of land in Wisconsin was forcefully ceded to the United States, the state of Wisconsin. So, people were growing corn in this area for a long time. Here's another picture of what it looks like also too. You can see these mounds of corn and these mounds of soil. And what's I think kind of interesting, honestly, is you don't when we think about agriculture, especially today, we think rows, we think, giant fields. You go and work up the soil, and you plant, machinery. But I think what's interesting and what I really want to emphasize is that in North America, and a lot of business agriculture in North America, but North America specifically, and South America too, you know, there was no plow agriculture. So we look all of history all around the world, this is from Asia to, medieval Europe to even very early Egyptian, and even thinking about like Mesopotamia and those early civilizations, they all utilized domesticated animals to to work these soils, to plow them up for planting fields. And there's been a lot of really interesting ideas, interpretations about, what this meant for how societies actually developed, It's more food, there was some scholars have said this actually introduced this idea of like social hierarchies, like, how ruling classes, it's controlling food systems, this introduction of these, systems and these, ways we do agriculture. However, again, this didn't happen in North America. There was no um, domesticated animal to work up soils to, massively transform land. And, there weren't like bison or horses or anything out there pulling tools. It was mainly done by people. And that's what we think about sort of the alternative way agriculture, farming, and how our food systems developed here in North America was there wasn't this, reliance on, a couple people and a tool and an animal. It was a community. It was lots of people doing agriculture. And so go back to these corn mounds, I think, and so with this in mind, we realized that this type of agriculture, very especially here in the Midwest, was the norm. Mounds and ridges maintained by communities of people. And logistically, we have to think about how exactly were people maintaining these? What what's so special about these mounds? Why mounds? Why ridges? Why were things working this way? When they've actually gone in recently and excavated these mounds at Carroll College, you can still see. So this layer at the very top is sort of this fill with like where like your lawn, your turf is. Right below that, you see this dark layer right here where I have the red circle. That's where the corn mound originally was, and they found that there's still a lot of high organic matter. So what we see out in our gardens here in Chicago, that high organic matter layer is still persistent, meaning that over time, this was a way people were doing agriculture that was very specialized and focused on this one tiny area, for example. And what I mean by this little point right here is it's an optimized area without working up the entire field. So it's sort of like why they couldn't have used animals or plows to, till up the whole field. So they had to use these mounds and be really optimal, really intentional about, what exactly was the impact on land from farming. And,
Hey,
you
real
know,
quick, I don't think
yeah.
that we're seeing the presentation.
What?
Ah, sorry.
Oh no.
Oh, you can see it. People are seeing it. I just can't see it on my end.
I can see it.
Oh, oh my God. Okay, you
My
scared me.
apologies.
I
I'm
was
so
like,
sorry.
if I just been talking and no one's
Ignore
been
me.
okay. Okay, just making sure everyone can see it now, right? We're good.
Yes,
Okay,
I can
cool.
see it.
All right, thank you. That was oh God, scared me for a second. All right. Anyway, so I mentioned mounds, and these are obviously the corn mounds right here that have been utilized, but there's also ridges. And near Green Bay, there's a lot of, there's in Wisconsin, there's a lot of fascinating archaeological work about indigenous agriculture, indigenous farming. This is near Green Bay, these ridges actually of these rich fields or raised garden beds where people would mix organic matter and soil and form these ridges essentially. And this picture on the bottom right, so this sort of like shape, this I don't even know what kind of shape that is. That's like the dark lines right here. That's like the village site. Then all these like parallel lines represent the ridges of like agricultural ridges where people were growing crops basically. And and so I present all this work to you, and I think it's kind of interesting to ask, okay, well, we're talking about just farming. Why am I talking about the past? Like, why is this just why are these black and white pictures? What's going on here? And that's very much because from what I've sort of also another quick cool note, there was a really cool research paper that came out this year that talked about even the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, they still found these like rich fields that were, that existed there, used by indigenous peoples for centuries. They worked with the Menominee tribe from Wisconsin. And again, sort of this idea that even science, Western science is still discovering how complex, how even adaptive and how intensive indigenous agriculture was this far up north and in North America in general. And so as I mentioned, bring up all these black and white pictures. And the reason for that, because I think people view indigenous farming, indigenous agriculture as this very past or ancient idea, which is why if you go and read about it, a lot of the work is archaeology. A lot of it's, these historical narratives, explorers talking about how what they were seeing when they were first coming into contact with indigenous peoples. And it's kind of interesting because, at least from my background, my understanding, as a researcher, as a scientist, a lot of like, I think now we're obviously looking at different ways to sustainably manage lands, manage our ecosystems, reduce, improve mitigation on climate change. And there's been a lot of like progress on working with indigenous peoples and these knowledge ways to answer these questions. We think about on the far right here, fisheries in the Northwest, researchers and land management people are working together to understand, how can we utilize indigenous systems to you know, preserve species for preserve fisheries. And then also thinking about the bottom left, fire ecology, how, and there's lots of work in California about how working with indigenous peoples to, utilize fires in their traditional ways to as a way to mitigate fires, which was a very big topic of discussion this past few years with the with like the wildfires that occurred in California. And then also I think yeah, so there's really been this intersection and these exchanging of ideas between like Western-based management practices and indigenous ways of knowing that have occurred in other ways of land management, but that really hasn't happened in agriculture, which is interesting because agriculture is really this, it's one of the most significant transformers of, changes of our landscapes. It's also one of the biggest significant, you know, um, contributors to climate change as well. So it's very much a interesting idea. So why are we viewing indigenous farming in the past? Indigenous people are still here. Indigenous people are still very much farming crops here. And so the question that I sort of asked then is, well, practically speaking, what does it look like? Are indigenous people still utilizing those mounds and ridges? And the answer is yes, on a smaller scale though, because again, that requires community efforts. People had to always be out there in the fields working and, maintaining everything with our modern day obligations and our somewhat colonized and West settler colonial state, it is hard for us to do that. But on smaller scales, you'll see like here my picture on the left where I'm standing in this garden where someone's doing a Three Sisters garden, and it's a very limited scale. However, on larger scales, you're not seeing these, more traditional practices done. You're seeing this hybrid of ideas. And when we talk about just farming, we're not just talking about how things were done in the past. We're talking about things how are being done in the future and currently. And so on larger scales, no, and that's what I'll sort of talk about. For my dissertation, oh, I guess I can, is there any questions we can answer right now? Sorry, trying to pull up the comments.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So from that picture, like a slice of like the soil where
Mhm.
this corn was found, how deep was that?
It wasn't that deep. Because like again, that was like that top layer, it was like turf basically. So it was just like I would say probably like less than a couple feet deep because even those earlier pictures, they're on the surface and like there's story and I think even some places they're still very much like there. I've heard stories about people they still hold graduations in that like part of the college and they just put chairs on top of like the corn mounds and so it's like this uneven sort of like seating arrangement basically. So they're still very much there. It's like that actual layer though is like a little bit deeper because the rest has been covered by like turf, for example. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'll go ahead and continue. Feel free to ask anything. So my work in Wisconsin when I was doing my PhD, for example, was discussing how you know how are tribal people, how are indigenous people doing agriculture today? And so I was working with communities in Wisconsin that were really interested in growing more of the traditional corn varieties. They really wanted to, feed their communities, preserve traditional varieties, but then also they didn't really want to fall into they didn't want to fall into the line of just doing conventional agricultural practices. They didn't want to, just rely on just machinery. They definitely didn't want to use like genetically modified crops, chemicals, heavy tillage, because again, as I mentioned before, those things weren't how it was done before. They know they don't have to till up the soil to have productive cropping systems. They know they don't need pesticides. They have productive cropping systems. So we were sort of developing this new hybrid system. We're implementing modern, because I was with the organic research team at UW-Madison. We're introducing these organic practices that we can practice alongside these traditional practices, create these very hybrid systems that tribal people felt more comfortable being in, this contemporary agricultural system that is, modern day farming, but also still while being grounded to their traditional ideas. And what we did was that we were interested in cover crops, and cover crops are just these non-harvested plants that, add organic matter and reinforce soil structure, but they're also spatially there to increase diversity. So on the far left, you'll see this rows of corn, but then in between, it's kind of hard to see, but you'll see these seeded sprouting cover crops. And then they'll grow with the corn in the middle of the season, and they'll sort of against in a way like battle the weeds. So right here in the middle, that's what the cover crops are growing in the mid-season, and they're also taking up and competing with weeds. But the idea is that the following season they overwinter, and then you get in the spring here a nice regrowth of the cover crop. So this is what tribal growers were very much interested in implementing because it wasn't relying on tillage. You could use it to suppress weeds. They didn't want to use herbicides, and they didn't want to use chemicals because it also works to break up disease cycles as well. And so my work spanned across the whole state. I worked with nonprofits, tribal governments, individual tribal growers, and we're sort of pulling our knowledge together to really create new, talk about traditional ecological knowledge as it's sort of like this antiquated like knowledge system, but no, it's very adaptive, it's very new. So we're creating this new traditional ecological knowledge together to understand how we can farm, sustainably at larger scales while still aligning ourselves with these traditional agricultural values. And this poster on the right is sort of a testament to that. I was working with the agricultural co-op on the Oneida Nation, and for 5 years we were trialing these cover cropping practices, getting it right, getting it wrong, but that was like a way that we built our relationships together. That was a way we strengthened the ties between the university and also the tribal nations. And so over that's a lot of the base for my work. A lot of my work is really just, working with people to, trial these practices to help build capacity, really. And so it sort of raises another question. Well, why exactly were these communities so interested in cover crops and especially interseeding them? And I think it goes back to what I was discussing about how, it's very much analogous to traditional agricultural systems in the region where, you're not relying on tillage, you're just seeding cover crops, and those cover crops are actually introducing crop diversity, which is also what has been done here on these lands for century too. Something that people may be more familiar with is the Three Sisters, which is, corn, beans, and squash that's grown on a mound of soil. It's the milpa in Central America, and these were all crops that are domesticated by indigenous people and traded throughout Turtle Island. And I was particularly interested in this because it's just so cool. And I think like again, it's sort of indicative of like people were very much doing like those mounds and ridges was where people were doing three sisters agriculture for a long time. And when we're doing cover crops, they wanted to sort of recreate that system where they can, easily utilize, you know, modern day cover crops, but also still achieve the same outcomes. And I worked a lot with the Three Sisters for my own research. A quick little rundown is that, the corn is that main carbohydrate growing, and you usually plant that first. It also has these horizontal roots. The roots will kind of grow with the mounds, sort of more so on the surface. That lignified stem is very important for it growing tall. And what's called in the plant ecology, it takes that place of the grass. The corn's a grass, so it has that grass sort of function. And the beans being the source of protein have the more vertical roots, so they're not really interacting a lot with the corn roots, and we call that they're not really competing with the corn roots per se. And they have those tendrils that climb up the lignified stem. And then with beans, they are nitrogen fixers, so they sort of have that legume function of introducing nitrogen into the soil. And then squash, which is grown at the base of the mound, has these large leaves that shade the soil. People have told me that the leaves and like their little prickliness deter raccoons. That didn't really work for me. So I mean, they definitely still were like good at covering the soil and everything. And as a plant pathologist, I study how plants interact with microbes, like such as pathogens and beneficial ones. And I was really interested in this idea about how, what's going on above ground influences the microbes below ground. Because we know, for example, that plants have a plethora of microbes to interact with, just like how we have like our little gut microbiome and the microbes on our skin and everything. The same goes for plants, and plants definitely influence what microbes live on them. But also, in a in an interesting way, the microbes influence plant outcomes, and this is something that a lot of ecologists and even agricultural scientists are really trying to understand with our cropping systems, because we know that yields in general have sort of flatlined. So they're really looking at soil and microbes as the next way to boost yields, to boost productivity. And what's interesting for me is that, we're also talking about ways of moving away from monoculture, so planting multiple crops as opposed to just one crop, which is what the Three Sisters is. And no one's really investigated how microbes are influencing, these intercropping systems like the Three Sisters. We know very much how microbes are influencing somewhat like natural plant communities like forest or prairie, but we don't know how that in between basically. And so that was a lot of what my research was looking at. I was understanding what microbes were living on the roots of corn, beans, and squash, these distinct microbiomes, like we have a gut microbiome. And because again, it's sort of I think these traditional systems influence a lot of farming that's happening now, but they also can answer a lot of key scientific questions that we have now about agriculture practically. And and that's why I'm saying it's very important for science because it's something that exists that's time tested, but also can tell us a lot. And so the main result that I found, which is kind of interesting, is that when all three crops were grown together, their microbial communities became less distinct and they all sort of harmonized or homogenized. And ecologically speaking, I can answer more questions about that if people are interested. Ecologically speaking, we think that is what leads to less disease. Pathogens are really bad competitors. So when you introduce other plants who have other microbes with them, that creates more issues for pathogens to deal with, essentially. And again, research can tell us a lot about, sustainable agriculture, because this is really what the research is trying to focus on basically. How can we move from monoculture and how can we diversify and grow at least multiple crops? And, if we think about the current state of farming right now, why is this important? Yeah? Or is there a question or okay, I'll
Yes,
finish.
that was me.
Yeah,
Oh,
go ahead. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
don't know. Oh, I was just wondering, which microbes in particular harmonize together, or which insects?
Yeah, so we're
I
talking
think I know,
about
but I don't know.
yeah, so the work I was doing wasn't so we're talking about like microbial communities. So it's all the microbes living there, not just the good ones and the bad ones. So what we saw specifically was that microbes that were, we call them host-specific microbes. So say a corn microbe, which is usually a microbe that's specifically always attached to corn plants. We saw those being reduced. And usually those plant-specific microbes are usually pathogens because plant pathogens and plants have a very connected evolutionary relationship, meaning that they're always going to be found together because they're always trying to battle it out. So we think that those plant-specific microbes, which are hypothesized to be pathogens, are the ones being reduced. And I'm still very much going through the data and digging to try to find which specific ones because it's a lot of stuff to go through. But that's actually a really good question. That's very what I'm thinking about too, obviously, as well. I really like that question. Thank you.
We have
Thank you.
two we have two other questions. If you don't mind, can we
No,
take
yeah, go
and
ahead. Yeah.
answer those as well?
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
so we had one from Feli. I don't know if I missed it, but can someone give me a really basic explanation of how mounds work? And we had another one from Elise. What plants are making up the cover crop mix with the corn?
Okay, yeah. So for the mounds, that is usually so you have your soil and then you have organic matter, like high organic matter, like so we think in the paper that I mentioned, so there's a paper that came out this year talking about how they excavated some ridges and up in the Upper Peninsula. And with those, they said they found a lot of like household refuse in those ridges. That means like something analogous to compost. So it's a mixture of soil and sort of like organic matter, household refuse compost. And that's usually what I've heard and been told that's sort of how they're made too. When I was making my mounds for the experiment, I would just mix soil and then also mix like some compost from the garden had and a 50-50 mix. And that's how I would do it. And that's usually what like worked out pretty well. So there's always this, and it's sort of interesting because if you think about the efficiency of it, you're not adding compost to a whole field. You're adding compost to a one mound, which is very optimal and a lot easier, honestly, to get like make sure those nutrients are getting to that crop. So I think that's part of like how the mounds and round ridge system works, that you're ensuring those nutrients are only hitting those crops. Because there's actually a really big issue now about how a lot of the fertilizers we spray, about everything that we do, a lot isn't even really sucked up by the crops actually. And then for the cover crops, the communities I was working with in Wisconsin, we kind of a lot of the cover crop research now emphasizes what's called multifunctionality. So when you have multiple types of cover crop species, so we had a winter wheat, we had a clover, and then we had like a chicory and plantain mixture. Sort of again hitting all those different types of plants, your grass, your legume, your leafy forb, and trying to really introduce that multifunctional diversity. And you always want to have multiple cover crops because if one fails, you have those other ones that are still there that keep up the pace and make sure like they're still doing their jobs because making sure they still, include that have that organic matter in the soil, like they're still suppressing disease, basically. That's a good question.
We have one hand raised as well.
Of
Vivian,
course,
you want to
yeah.
come off mute?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I've tried my hand at Three Sisters. Um Sometimes in Latin America people also call it cuatro hermanas, like the four
Hmm.
sisters. Some people either supplant them with either sunflowers or amaranth.
Hmm.
But in my time t taking a stab at it, I always get the timing wrong in terms of when to plant which thing. And in the picture that you share, I saw the corn was a good like 3 to 4 feet tall, and then the beans were like just coming out. I've been advised by folks from Mexico to put all three different types of seed at the same time. And I've done it all, but I'm wondering if you could advise into like what does timing look like in terms of actually achieving Three Sisters? Because I cannot crack it.
No, yeah,
Thank you.
that's a really good point. I'm glad you bring that up because that's very indicative of like, I've gone to different farming conferences. I've heard the grandmas and the aunties talk about how they do it. It can all be very different basically and how it's like there's no one true way. I was utilizing the Haudenosaunee, so the Iroquois knowledge around it, and they typically plant the corn first, and then I was told like 2 to 3 weeks later you plant your beans, which sort of makes sense to me because, well, there's always lots of issues with like birds and like pests coming in. I mean, at the garden I was working at, we had turkeys coming in, so they would like pick out the corn and like kill them basically in like the first couple of weeks. So it's mainly that, but I think really the corn just has a head start. I don't really understand or know why, but I think what did they do to prevent pests eating their crops? So that's I'll sort of answer that question now, Musa. So they would tell me to soak seeds in mayapple, like to pick mayapples, like those little like plants, like the big leaves off the ground, and like make a tea out of it and soak them in the tea. And I think in my head, like that's the way that like maybe like like shields the scent or something. Like see, you're supposed to germinate them in that tea mixture and then you plant that. And I think that like she makes it smell like another plant or does make it seem like corn. I don't know. It's like I sound like crazy sometimes thinking about how to deter from pests. There really isn't even a way to deter pests. For a lot of my experiments were taken by deer and raccoons, and most I think after 5 years, what everyone told me was that you just have to plant more for our animal relatives. Basically, they have to get their share, and then you can have yours. So it's just always just plant a little more and expect there always to be that. But back to sort of the planting time. I always go green corn first because I think the beans do kind of end up growing a little quicker and they kind of need that tendril and sort of ensures that that tendril that they're able to start climbing on the corn immediately basically because I would have these treatments or have these experimental plots without corn and just beans and I have to go in like really quickly and get these stakes in there because unless they would start like going out and like getting all crazy and going on other plants basically. And then what do we think about? Okay, so yes, Diana, that is a really good question. That's like the basis for a lot of like the cover crop work I was doing. So that's for a lot of, okay, so for convention, like large scale organic farmers, you don't really see like competition between cover crops and the plants because with these really high vigorous like corn hybrids, they're already like at a pretty good stage and the cover crops are just coming out. Some people see their cover crops really late when the corn's really tall, but there's also like a fine line because if you plant them when the corn's too tall, then they'll shade out the cover crop. So it's like it's all like you have this trial and error basically. When I was working with my tribal collaborators in Wisconsin, that was actually kind of an issue sometimes because we because again, like there's not a really big like we're sort of also working on like what fertilizer inputs are working best or what like works well. So there were some years where I think there was like less fertilizer and nutrients inputs, and we would see that competition occur between cover crops and the corn. But then we would get that like fertilizer input just right and like adequate enough for all crops to be there, then you wouldn't really see that competition. Normally in the literature, you don't see competition. You like there's no like you don't see any like blatant positive impacts on yield, but like you usually see like a more neutral effect. So I would say whenever it's like when you seed the cover crop is like the definite like the would be the outcome for your question basically. If you see that very early on, then you may experience more competition because the corn plants are still young. If you see later on, you may have less cover crop biomass because it's being shaded out by the corn, but there's less competition. So it's all very much like a fine line. That's what we're working with, just like how like each year wasn't the same. And that's sort of indicative of all, sustainable ag practices where it's not just one glove fits all solution. It's not just a spray you can apply every year at the same time. It's you have to sort of listen to the land or listen to the climate and be like, when's the best time to do this? We did this like one year we did this time this year. Next year we had to do it like with the seed cover crops later this year because of the rain. Um, Teresa, I worked with so the Haudenosaunee Oneida in Wisconsin grew their white corn. Um, and we also we also grew Bear Island Flint when I was working at Menominee and Ho Chunk corn varieties. I forgot the name of it off the top of my head. When we're working with beans and squash, we did like this skunk bean. I have a picture of it later so you can see. And but yeah, the pole beans are um would make sense because again, it's like the idea that they're growing up that corn stalk basically. So it's like similar to a pole. And I think that's what a lot of the other bean varieties that I've seen sort of be as well. The cover crops, so they can be multifunctional in that way, Musa. The cover crops, but the cover crops, so they can be used for forage for cattle. Um, I mean, in theory, you can like harvest them, but it's usually just meant to be like worked into the soil. Like those root systems are doing the main job of like keeping soil grounded and keeping like preventing erosion. But usually, like you're working this cover crops back into the soil, and usually you're just letting them grow. Some cover crops are perennial, but it means they'll come back for several years. Basically, you just have to reseed them. So a lot of growers here in the Midwest, even non-indigenous growers are utilizing these cover crops, like these perennial cover crops, so to leave them in the ground, keep them growing. So they just like plant their corn in between the rows basically without having to till. So again, speaking of current farming, we can sort of get back to this really quick. So why are all these discussions we having very important right now? Like why are people asking these questions important? Because we are thinking about how to redo agriculture. We are thinking about how to revolutionize the system. The Green Revolution, people don't realize that we grow only in rows because that was the invention of herbicide. Like rows are only an invention of herbicide, which is kind of interesting. Um, the Green Revolution was very like emphasize those points where they optimize breeds for optimize different crops to grow in these environments heavily supplemented by nutrients, tillage, and chemicals. So this has been going on for a long time. That's where all the research has been going, which is why people always ask, why can't they, why can't farmers just easily transition to sustainable ag? And they can, but there's a lot of, again, these economic, political, social factors, sustainable farming, being able to experiment with new ideas isn't really supported. It's very risky, it seems. Politically, there isn't a whole lot of like backing for like, these sustainable farming ideas as well. Socially, I mean, it seems like some communities are like very against like even stuff like cover cropping. It's a little weird, but anyway, so and we currently exist in this farming system where, you know, we've had this all this optimization, but yet it's being tested by climate change. It's like all these droughts, all these pests, all these, things occurring. Well, ironically, it's still being the one thing by having to mitigate or by having to navigate climate change, these cropping systems are also contributing to it by increasing the fertilizers, increasing the use of chemicals, increasing the scale of agriculture to recover from yield loss. So again, it's sort of this system of like how exactly can we, what can indigenous farming really teach us? And I think one thing is always interesting is that, as I mentioned before, tillage is been such a massive, you know, part of agriculture around the world. But even today, it's still one of the ways people always see farming being done. But it doesn't really have to be like that. No-till is a thing. That's a new organic and conservation practice and like reduced tillage. But we know from here, people were not working up soils. They weren't tilling soils for centuries, and that's how agricultural systems existed here. And so, on these very lands, perhaps we don't really need to be doing that. We don't because we know erosion rates have significantly gone up. Loss of organic matter in soil has gone up. If you look at these maps of the Midwest, they see reducedness in like dark colored soils because these soils are being beat to hell by tillage and all these practices, basically. I think seeds are very interesting. Here are the seeds I was working with for my experiment. This is like a Oneida skunk bean and a Hubbard squash from the Haudenosaunee. We need a different way of looking at seed saving. I think Aaron Loden's presentation will probably go more into this, which is really interesting. But again, like this idea of that, seeds are, not seen in the business farming realm as, these corporate, products. They're living relatives, they're ideas, their knowledge that's being passed down. And whenever I'm given seeds, for example, I was running this experiment, I was given these seeds by a seed keeper, Dr. Rebecca Webster out of Oneida in Wisconsin. What she told me was that I'll give you these seeds and run your experiment, but just like bring back a bunch of seeds for me so I can mix them back into my own seed bank. So we maintain that genetic diversity, we maintain that diversity and that's, the histories that we were both growing in, we maintain that and mix it. And that's why even today, our modern crops, even though we genetically modify them a lot, we've lost a lot of traits of, drought resistance, disease resistance that they're actually starting to be like, well, we should maybe go back to these traditional varieties of crops to see what traits there are that are being lost. And that's a whole nother like realm of, potential issues in terms of like, who owns seeds, who, owns these stories, who is able to, you do what with what seeds. So that's a whole big thing I can get into more if you have questions about that. I think introducing diversity in their cropping systems is very interesting. Again, monocultures are what we see today and what people think that agriculture has to be, but they're a huge liability. It goes a lot to maintain these perfect rows and uniform plants, and we know for a fact that that's not really like long-term sustainable. And so I mean, obviously there's a lot, it's, easier said than done, but it has to go from a system of, high short-term intensive profits to, long-term benefits that we know that comes from intercropping. Having diversity in our crop system is good. Multiple crops introduces like other insects, animals, microbes. It's been shown pretty clear in research that multiple crops are able to suppress disease very well. And so there's so many like ways we can do that. And even the interesting cover crops work we're doing, that's like a very light way of like a very subtle way of introducing diversity into large scale farming systems that, can be done. And like it just has to be researched more because you have to always present farmers with, the evidence and why it works, because then they won't see it as risky to adopt, basically. And then I think what's always interesting, and from my perspective, I'm just some man, but being in these spaces, I was very special because it's seeing how the role of women in indigenous farming systems has always been very fascinating. So we know that a lot of native cultures are matriarchal, and we know that the idea of community is very inherent in this sense because you need lots of people to maintain these systems. Even though we're interested in cover crops, we're planting with a corn planter, everyone would still come out at the end of the season and hand harvest a lot of these crops. So it's important. Sort of a tangent and interesting sort of thing to think about. This is the Berger figurine. If you ever are in St. Louis or driving through St. Louis, Cahokia, which is one of the major indigenous metropolitan ancient cities in North America, is there also too. I recommend you check out these giant earth mounds. And there's always been a narrative around the Cahokia. Around 1100 AD, it had the same population as London did in the UK. So this was a very, large city. And there's always been a narrative about how, oh, archaeologists or, historians think it was some top-down power society where, the nobility and the priestly class were colluding to control the population. And when they've done more like actual like archaeology and actual more like asking indigenous people who trace their roots to Cahokia, because there's lots of tribes like my tribe in Muskogee Creek in the southeast, a lot of tribes in the plains say they come from the mound builders of Cahokia. They will say that, oh no, like, for example, this Berger figurine is recognized by tribes in the plains as like the Earth Mother figure. And how they are running their agricultural systems. We hypothesize that how tribes there running their agricultural systems very much parallels how they were doing it back in Cahokia, like back 100 centuries ago. And it sort of redefined this narrative of like, it wasn't this top-down structure, it was actually a bottom-up structure where matriarchal clans were, you know, all holding power, and like their power was through how much food they're growing. It was a more equitable system, basically. There wasn't like this tribute to like a king or something. So I think, women were the original plant scientists. They were domesticating crops. They were the ones, understanding what worked and what didn't, and that's why I love having my wife around with me. She's also indigenous with the work that I do because she's able to help me and inform me better on like, what exactly all this means and why this is important, and what just us both being out there and doing it means actually too. And then also, again, I was working with co-ops or groups that really didn't care about like the long-term profit. It was more so community involvement, those community outcomes, how are people being involved? What are people being fed? Like, is there, so I think that's sort of something else to think about as well. I'll obviously answer more questions about that. And so I've led you on this whole journey, his whole thing. But we can say what indigenous farming is, and that it's very this meticulous and adaptive interaction with land by indigenous people here in North America that grow crops. Relying on that crop diversity, both how many crops were growing in the field, like the Three Sisters, and also the genetic diversity of those crops. And then those non-intensive methods, preparing ground, like mounds in the soils that historically were always here instead of tillage. And then because these were all maintained by communities, there's that sense of, like there's always the cultural exchange of knowledge and that interface where food and culture and, passing down this idea goes on for centuries. And that's why, corn in itself is it's culturally a significant crop for many and all indigenous cultures here in North America. And there's a reason why for that, because there's so much knowledge, there's so much cultural sharing and cultural exchange around it too. And so a few final thoughts though, like so you think I was able to put in, and then I can answer questions after this. Foraging or farming, there are more crops than just corn here in North America. Before corn, okay, so in the Southwest, corn was there for close to like 3,000 to 6,000 years. Like it's been there for a long time in the Southwest. I'm sure Aaron Loden will talk about that in his talk. Here in basically in the eastern part of the United States, like Mississippi River area and east, corn took a long time to establish because there was already these crops right here being grown like pretty consistently for a very long time by indigenous peoples like marshfelder, goosefoot, maygrass, like sunflower. And it shows like how interesting, like how, diverse these crops were. And we don't really know why corn took forever to really take off here, but they say it's because there are already all these cool crops being grown. And they weren't like really foraging for these plants. It had like intentional seedings in areas, so it's like they knew where they were going. So foraging, if you know, like if you consistently like do it in the same area, or like know if you intentionally put it there, you know. Anyway, that's just sort of an interesting thing. And then, okay, another final thought. Traditional ecological knowledge, you may hear this term being tossed around a lot. I mentioned it earlier. I usually don't like toss it around a whole lot or say it a whole lot for several reasons. Has many definitions, both scholarly and within any like community member, like just person you talk to. Kind of a buzzword in my opinion now, often overused because it's like customary definitions. I've seen it as like this idea where people see it as, oh, it's, or Western science, then like traditional ecological knowledge. It's like there's two alternatives. I see it as like two sides of the same coin. It's seems very human nature to, see something, not make an observation, ask a question, do an experiment. And I think it's just to, how culturally here in North America people went about doing that and how other parts of the world, what science is seen as sort of way of doing that. But I really think of it as more of this collaborative concept where if we think about the work I was talking about in Wisconsin, where I was working with the tribal growers, I had traditional knowledge coming in. The community members had traditional knowledge. And then even researchers at UW who weren't indigenous had their like scientific knowledge. So we were all coming together to pool our knowledge to understand like what's the best way forward? How do we go about this? How do we pull together? So it's really this when you hear people talk about this, I think you should really see it as more of this collaborative concept where it's like, different perspectives because indigenous knowledge is always about sharing. We're always sharing knowledge with people. Obviously, there's some things we don't share, but I mean, in terms in general, like the sustainable and like land managements, there's always this pooling and like sharing of knowledge, basically. And I think there's a really good paper about this. It's not too bad of a read, but it's talking about how this exact idea. And I was seeing in a lot of my work where we weren't really following one traditional knowledge system. It was like us pulling together because we were creating a new type of cropping system, basically. Um, Okay, so we're gonna follow my work. I have a paper out. I'm still working on other ones. I think the newborn sort of is making that go a little harder, but eventually I will get to those. I really want to write that Three Sisters paper I was talking about earlier with my work. I'm on Blue Sky. I don't really post a whole lot at all. Try to make a website. Honestly, the best way to just reach out to me is just send me an email right here. I'm always very open to responding and answering questions. Think of a time to meet, discuss more. Like, please just feel free to email me at any time. I'm very open to talking about these things, answering questions. And then a few of the things that here are some books I recommend. Research a Ceremony is a seems kind of intensive. It's actually a very short read. Like my wife like who got it for the first time. It's a very small book. She finished in like 3 hours when I gave it to her. Um Feeding Cahokia is a really cool book talking about indigenous farming, talking a lot about what I was talking about earlier with Cahokia, this idea about how, changing the narrative behind how indigenous societies really functioned and how and the role of agriculture in those societies, particularly the role of women and women farmers. And then a really cool biodiversity in North America, just talking about the way different indigenous peoples around North and Central and South America were interacting with their environments, not necessarily through farming, but other ways. Again, these cool books exist. There's other books besides Bringing Sweetgrass People. So I mean, feel free to expand the knowledge. And there are other really, and oftentimes these aren't coming from indigenous perspectives, but they're always usually the best ones are usually them collaborating with indigenous perspectives, indigenous peoples, which is what a lot of these books do, and which is what I think is important to do also as well. And then other cool resources. I didn't really have a whole lot because it's like things I don't really think about, but just in the Seed Keepers Network is really cool. They have a lot of like resources about like seed keeping and like certain practices. North American traditional indigenous food systems. I think it's the one it's like run by the sous chef, Sean Sherman in like Minneapolis. It's a really cool website. There's like lots of cool resources on there. When I was at UW-Madison, we just got this really big grant to work on, you know, this exact thing, working with indigenous communities to build, these food systems. And there's going to be a lot of cool resources, a lot of cool things coming out of that. So I suggest you check it out. It's been going on for a while. My work was sort of like the thing that started it off, and then, it's been expanded. There's more indigenous grad students there now that are continuing the work and everything. So yeah, that I can stop there and take more questions.
If anyone has questions, you're welcome to come off mute and share them. If not, I have a few questions, so please share your questions. They're definitely more fun than mine.
Okay, I see one. Genevieve, Owamni in Minneapolis is run by the sous chef. That's really my wife and I have been there several times. We like it a lot. They have a lot of indigenous dishes. Um, I think also Takabe in Denver is another one of like actual like restaurants like that exist. Yes, Tiffany.
Sorry about that.
You're
Are
good.
there any other indigenous crops that were grown together that harmonize with each other besides the squash, corn, and the beans?
Yeah, so that's like something I've asked a lot or like been trying to find out actually too. That's a really good question. So when I mentioned those Eastern agricultural crops complex, like the goosefoot, the little barley, they've those were grown in like sort of like sections of a field per se, not like necessarily together, but it's like sections in the
Mm,
field. And like I mean that's crop diversity in itself because it's like even like that spatial diversity you're having there is really good. Like that, farmers today utilize strips of like natural prairie land in between the rows of corn because that's like even just introducing a tiny sliver of like that diversity is good. But so there wasn't really a whole lot of like interseeding of those. When the mounds and bridges came about is really when things kicked off, I think, with the intercropping systems of like the corn and the beans. The question earlier mentioned that there's like I've seen like four, seven sisters, there's like I've seen like sunflowers that are grown around like the mounds or areas to prevent like cross-pollination from corn. There's like amaranth also too. I just know specifically like it just seems like in like that ridge mound system, those three, there was some sort of like something clicked a long time ago, and those were the ones that really were consistently grown together. And I mean, if we look at it too, I mean, there's been a lot of like there's been some plant ecology work that's shown like how the root systems aren't necessarily like interacting a whole lot, means they're not competing a whole lot. There's different there's different breeds, different varieties of like these corn beans and squash that are grown in different environments, maybe. There's not a whole lot known about like how exactly they're different, but we're assuming that a lot of these crops, like the heirloom crops that I was working with, we I hypothesized that because of their breeding history, they may be better at dealing with growing with other crops than like our modern corn varieties, which are usually grown to be, grown by themselves in the field, heavily supplemented by fertilizers and sprays. So those crops that we see today are really bad. They're pretty wimpy actually without all those like resources. The indigenous crops we think are the ones that are bred to be grown with other crops basically. And I've seen that in my research too, where they're a little hardier, we're able to deal with weeds a little better too.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Thank you.
Any final thoughts or questions from our guests here?
Hi, sorry, I just want to just speak up. It's not a question, but I just want to say thank you for your work in Wisconsin, especially the contribution that it had on our tribal elder food boxes. We distribute them at our health center, and our elders really look forward to them every month. So, thank you so much for all that you did in helping them uh, continue to create these crops for our elders.
Oh yeah, thank you, Diana. It was really cool to be a part of all that. I think we talk about food sovereignty and food policy. These are all like upper level, higher up administrative things. But I think what's often forgot is like people actually have to like grow the food and like, have productive, resilient cropping systems, to actually maintain the supply. So it's like it really comes down to like going in, being present and trialing multiple years to really nail it down. And that's what we're trying to do basically for a lot of these systems in Wisconsin, get them confident enough to like, build that capacity basically. Because we've seen what happens when people try to build capacity and then like, something goes wrong and like, tribal governments lose faith or, it's like hard to recover from things like that. So common cover crop species, Kai, I've clovers tossed around a lot. It's always a good one, like for nitrogen. It depends what you want from your system. If you want like extra nutrients, we'll go with something like a clover. Grasses are really good at adding like that structure to soil because like they're really intensive grass roots. They're also good at like keeping that carbon ratio good in your soil as well. Um, Stuff like radishes or brassicas have a really deep like tap root, so they'll like penetrate the soil and like kind of loosen it up for planting. So just there's lots of different multifunctionality basically. And there's stuff that's like better for pollinators, stuff that's like just better for soil health as a whole. Like I've seen these like really diverse mixtures where they have like 15 to 20 species in like a seeding packet and they'll just like seed those and they'll all look really cool basically. Just having that crop diversity, I think is the most important thing. Is you can have all these different species, but it's good to grow them in mixture basically.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
This was awesome. I actually just did a thing with College of DuPage today, and they're talking a lot, and I see this a lot, where a lot of these larger places are talking about, you know, I didn't mean to laugh, but with the TEK, it has become a
Yeah.
buzzword where, of course, this is the month where we get our land acknowledgements and we get our, sort of called in. And I asked if they would be open to start working with Indigenous-led programming, especially with their horticulture department, not to add like more weight onto your very busy schedule, but do you foresee more programming like this existing and like the possible collaboration, especially out here in Illinois with, we have a project out here where they're trying to build an Indigenous educational and ecological center on some Potawatomi ground, and they want it to be Indigenous led. Do you see this is something that going forward may be opportunities to create Indigenous led projects to talk about this stuff?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good, yeah, I definitely see that. I think something that also is like worth bringing up. So when I'm in Wisconsin, like even from where I'm from, Oklahoma too, the tribal presence is still very much there. Those historical presence is still very much there. Like this, what was told to me by like some archaeology friends was that like Wisconsin was like there was like a when the state was first founded in the 1800s, there were people that were very eager to like preserve and maintain all like these structures basically, which is why like a lot of them are still there or like were able to be documented. But there's kind of an issue though. I think like there's this disconnect that can occur when, states or, areas don't really still have that indigenous presence anymore. And, for example, Illinois has like maybe like one or two recognized tribes, and that's it compared to like obviously the more people that were here, the Illini had, they were historical accounts about their fields, their rich fields going on for miles. The Black Hawk War, which was fought in Wisconsin, started here in northern Illinois because of like conflicts over, agricultural crops basically. So I think it all starts really with like really understanding, who was here. Like, can we get like, people that come from the people that were here to, lead these efforts? Because I think that's where it really starts off. That's like really the important part. It can't obviously it can be like it can't just be any indigenous person. It has to be, have to be guided by, what was really going on here initially. I think that's where some areas of the country really struggle. Like for the East Coast, for example, where contact first happened, a lot of those, cultures and peoples don't exist anymore or like been integrated in other tribes. So it's hard for them. I know I've talked to people, it's hard for them to have like that connection to land or like understand that connection to land when there's been like that, obviously that colonization and that removal process. And coming from Oklahoma, there are tribes there, only five, the 39 tribes are in Oklahoma, only five of them are originally from that area in Oklahoma. All of them were relocated there. So there's a lot of discussion that has to happen around that idea in particular. It's like, who was there originally? What were they actually doing? And what's like the actual knowledge system behind like, you know, what was going on here in Illinois, for example, in Chicago, because even, when I'm trying to do research for stuff here in Chicago, because I always like to be interested in that, there's, it's hard to find what was, really occurring. We need that more indigenous presence actually to like talk about that idea in itself.
Thank you, Widow.
You know?
Um, is it okay if I speak now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Um, you had a list up of native plants before, and I'm interested in doing like adding more indigenous type foods and plantings. Is there like a list that I can get online?
Um, okay, what's interesting about those, okay, so something I didn't talk about, I wanted to, but I think I was like just short on time or just like forgot about it. So a lot of those crops that I mentioned, so we have like stuff like sunflower and squash that were still grown today, obviously. One of the crops on there, goosefoot, sort of give you an idea of like indicate like what's happened. Goosefoot, it's a quinopodium, it's like a quinoa relative. It's supposed to have these like grains that are similar to quinoa. So when they've done the archaeology, they found that like back before corn was dominant, before like 900, 1000 AD, the seeds on the quinopodium, those grains were really big. But then over time, after corn came about, those seeds got smaller and smaller. So it's almost like they became undomesticated. So a lot of these crops became undomesticated because of the dominance of corn. Like gooseberry is still used for its leaves for some medicinal purposes, but no longer as a grain. That's sort of an interesting idea that it's like with the little barley and stuff, where at some point we have to, I guess, like re-domesticate those essentially to
I
to get those
see
where they were
that.
before. It's like, yeah, it's an interesting thing. And it's like again, people don't know why corn took off the way it did and like so late here in this side of the country, but because like there was so much time spent domesticating these other crops that like they actually became like undomesticated. It caused like this cultural shift with corn that occurred because a lot of tribal cultures today aren't really talking about like those other crops the way they talk about corn, for example.
Okay. All right. All right.
But
Thank you.
yeah, no, definitely, yeah. I guess Angie.
Hi. So, you were talking about how a lot of these seeds and crops are being undomesticated. I was curious to know, like, this is a follow-up question from Genevieve's question. Do you know if there's any research or any projects to re-domesticate these same crops? And if
Yeah.
so, who is doing it?
Yeah, so I mean that's I'm in one of the books I recommended, the Feeding Cahokia one, she talks about that at the very end, being like, there's a chance to do this. And so there really isn't because again, it's like, agricultural research is dominated by, just the dominant paradigm of like, how to maintain the current system, not really how to upend it per se. So there isn't really a whole lot. That's sort of interesting though, too, is because I think there is potential. Like it would be really easy to, our, you know, GMOs, biotechnology, it's a whole nother topic to talk about. But the current tools that we have, we could in theory do that very easily, bring a lot of like those like varieties back to have like larger grain size basically, or like sort of have them back to where they were before. I don't think it's currently being done right now, but I think it's kind of like, I think a cool step. We're really looking for like alternative food sources that come from like these very lands. I think we often think just, oh, corn or like different trees or whatever, but it's like there was actually a little more complexity in terms of like grains and other things that we had here outside of corn that I think it would be worth it, obviously, because, those crops, I think most likely had a little like smaller impacts on land and like less like required inputs, what it seems like from like the like historical and archaeological records too. That's a really good question though. It is fascinating. It's cool to think about like these other crops that like aren't being used anymore, basically. So
Cool. Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you. That's a cool question.
Hey, thank you so much, Daniel, for your time. We all greatly appreciate you. A reminder to the guests that we will be hosting events every Wednesday at 6 p.m. during November, and you can learn more and RSVP online through Eventbrite. That's the best way to find out more about the events themselves. Um, with that, thank you everyone for spending your Wednesday evening with us. Greatly appreciate you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for listening, y'all.
I'm going to leave the Zoom open for now. If anyone has any questions I can help you with, happy to help you.
Also, I can like answer a few more people are curious too as well.
So much to talk about.
I
So
know.
much. If anyone has any lingering questions, feel free.
Hi, I actually I just typed it in the chat, but I figure I'll jump in. So I put in there I just recently became a part of the Indigenous Seed Keeping Network, and
Mhm.
I had a wonderful gentleman from Ho Chunk who, he's kind of starting out his own. Well, he works within the tribe, but he's starting his own kind of like at home indigenous garden. And
Mhm.
he's like, I've seen obviously there's beans, there's corns, there's squash, there's this and that. And he goes, but I see that there's native cucumbers. He's like, has anybody heard of native cucumbers seeds being somewhere? So I was wondering if you had anything about that or knew,
Yeah. Yeah, the cucurbit story. So it's like the cucurbit family. That's interesting. I haven't heard of that, but I know like that. So squashes. Okay, so it's like let me collect my thought. Squash, they say, was domesticated sort of twice here, or like cucurbits were domesticated twice here in like North America. So there was the one initial one down like central Mexico, but they've also found evidence that like certain like cucurbit varieties have floated over from Africa just because like they're gourds basically to like North America actually. And so there's actually like different like even like in like you can still find like native cucurbits like in like very like wild native cucurbits growing in like the southern part of the United States actually. I don't know if they're like more related to cucumbers, I think they're more related to squash, but I don't really like off the top of my head, I don't know like the exact like distinction between like the how closely the squash and cucumbers are related, but I think that would be interesting though, because again, there is like I didn't know that when I like learned that, but there's like lots of like wild cucurbits like that are growing around that like eventually were domesticated, but also still exist or just like forage basically. So that's interesting. I'll have to look more into that.
Well, it was really interesting because so on the edge of the farm at the Potawatomi farm where I'm at, we have what's called wild cucumber, but it's the way it grows is more like a loofah, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard of it. But it was funny because he asked me about it, and I'm like, I don't think it's edible. I don't think that's something that we're supposed to eat.
hmm
Um, but yeah, I'm like, well, I'll reach out to those that I can to see. But yeah, so he was kind of he mentioned another type of produce, and I can't off the top of my head think of it, but it was another one outside of the, Three Sisters type. But thank you so much for your knowledge. I really appreciate
Yeah,
that.
no, that's a really cool question. I'll have to look into that. Yeah, definitely. Thanks. All right, I think I'll head out now. I have a newborn to attend to.
No doubt at all. Hey, thank you so much for your time.
Yes,
Appreciate
thank you very much.
it.
Like thank you, Tucker. That was really fun, and I appreciate you like helping run things.
Absolutely. Take care.
Oh, and thank you, Letty, for doing the interpretation.
Yeah. All
All
right,
right,
everyone. Take care.
good night.